Good morning and welcome in. My name is Helen Jennings. I'm a Stampin' Up demonstrator based here in the UK, and Wednesday mornings is our time for our Back to Basics videos. So taking us back to look at the things that we need to know to get started really. So in the past few weeks we've looked at things like the paper and the ink and the adhesives. Last week we were talking about die cutting. And this week we're going to be looking at the technique and the thing that really got me hooked into card making in the first place. This is the thing that when I first saw it, made me go, wow, I want to be able to do that. And here I am, still doing that all this time later. So, I'm just trying to share this video out. As always, first thing on a Wednesday, you hear me fumbling around in the background as I'm trying to share this over to my Stamping Starters, my Ducky Stamping Starters page. So we're going to be looking this morning at heat embossing, and I think that for all of us the magic of heat embossing never quite goes away, and one of the joys that I have is teaching new people how to heat emboss and watching for them that magic whoa moment. So I am still fiddling. I manage 2 pages and it's wanting me to share a group with another page that I manage, and that won't work at all because it's a completely different sort of a page. I'll let that whir away a minute. So heat embossing. What do we need? The basics of heat embossing. You absolutely need a heat gun. Now you can't really do heat embossing without a heat gun. I've had lots of people say to me, can you use a hairdryer? And the answer is very definitely no. You really wouldn't want to be using this on your hair, let me tell you that for now, because it's getting incredibly hot. And likewise, a hairdryer does not get hot enough to heat the powder that we need it to. It doesn't get to that temperature. So whenever you're using a heat gun, you never want to really put your hand on this end, particularly equipment. If you're doing this with children do love heat embossing, but that's one of the first rules, is don't put your hand near that end because it is very, very hot. So no, you can't do this with a hairdryer. It very definitely needs to be a much stronger heat, much more intense heat, because the embossing powder that we'll use, and we'll look at that in a minute, is in actual fact sort of ground up pieces of plastic. Morning Div. So what you're doing essentially is melting plastic. So you need the temperature to be high enough to be able to do that. So we have our heat guns. This is one of my Stampin' Up heat guns. These are dual temperature, so you get the highest heat and a sort of slightly more gentle heat. If you're heat embossing, you nearly always you'd want the higher heat. The sort of other setting comes into its own if you're doing things like shrink plastic, where you don't want it to get quite so hot quite so quickly. But generally speaking, or actually if you're drying paint and things, you might not want it to be quite so hot. But with your heat embossing, you've got a 2-setting heat gun and you need it on the highest setting. So you need a heat gun of some sort. Now, if you're going for a Stampin' Up heat gun, do always check in the catalogue that you are ordering the one with the UK plug. excuse me, I've got a bit of a runny nose this morning. You really don't want to be using the one, ordering the one with the EU plug. Ask me how I know that. So yeah, you do always need to make sure that if you're here in the UK, you're ordering the correct heat gun. Always make sure you're ordering the one with the UK plug. So you need a heat gun, and of course you need some embossing powder. Now we have quite a range. Let's flick and see if we can find the embossing powder in the catalogue. Embossing paste, embossing powder. So stamping emboss powder, here it is. We've got a whole list down this bottom bit just here: black, clear, copper, gold, silver, white, and it mentions shimmer black and shimmer white. Here in the UK we're yet to get our hands on that. We are having a few issues. It is proving they have sort of brought in some new regulations at customs, where it's coming into the warehouse, into the German warehouse. There have been some issues with new regulations through customs, and there seems to be a lot of moving of goalposts. So there are some items that we are struggling to get, that Stampin' Up are working really hard to get all the paperwork correct and all of those sorts of things. So eventually that will get to us, but for the moment we haven't got the shimmer white or the shimmer black, but we have got gold and white and black and copper and silver and clear. So we've got a whole host of embossing powders that we can play with, and the two that I've got on my desk at the moment are the white one and the gold one. Now your embossing powders actually come, let me grab one out of my box of spares. They come in a little tub. So I don't know what have we got here. This is a silver one. So this is one as yet unopened. So they come in a little plastic tub like this with all your powder in. Now it's amazing how far and how long a tub like that will last you. They last me a long time, and I'm doing classes and things. So a little tub like that will last you a long time. What I always do is I decant those little tubs into some of these big plastic tubs, and takeaway boxes are really good for this. These are just little cheap boxes I got from a local cheapie shop, and I've labelled them all up, labelled them on the top and on the side. Morning, Robin. 4 a.m. heading into work. Goodness me, that's nice and early. So what I have in my boxes, I have our little, and that looks like a tiny amount, but it's amazing how far that will still go. So I've got my powder in here, and I've got a little plastic spoon. It looks like I might need to treat myself to a new plastic spoon at some point. You could of course use any sort of spoon. It doesn't have to be a plastic one. It's just that I had some of these lying around. It could be a metal one, it could be a wooden one. The makeup of the spoon is not really very important. So I have a box with my powder in and my spoon, as I say, and I've got one of these for each colour embossing powder, and I find it useful, as when we play in a minute you'll see, for a couple of reasons, and sort of only one of them is storing them. So gold embossing powder, as I say, and I've got it on the lid, and I've also got it on the box. One reason that is important is particularly with the white one, because the white embossing powder and the clear embossing powder look virtually the same. So it's important to make sure that you're putting your right lid on your right box, and that you've actually got white embossing powder in there and not clear, because they both, once heated, then do look a little bit different. The white one obviously stays white, the clear one obviously goes clear, as the name would suggest. So heat gun, embossing powder. For a majority of heat embossing, we tend to use Versamark ink. Now, Versamark is a watermark stamp pad, so that means that if you stamp a stamp onto, so if I was to stamp Versamark onto this blue piece of card, it would almost look like I've done a tone-on-tone stamp. You would get like a watermark effect, and I think we looked at that when we were looking at the different inks. So it does do that, but Versamark is also a sticky ink, so it has quite a bit of glycerin in, so it is quite sticky. So that makes it really useful when you're heat embossing, because you will stamp your image, and when you sprinkle on your embossing powder, because it is sticky, it will grab that embossing powder and you will get the shape of the stamp in embossing powder, if you see what I mean. So you'll have stamped the image onto the card. That image will then grab the embossing powder, and you will have that image then covered in embossing powder, which you can then heat up. So Versamark ink. Now you don't actually have to have Versamark ink in order to emboss. Embossing powder will actually stick to anything that is damp, greasy, any of those sorts of things, which is where this little chap comes in, because actually quite often you don't want your embossing powder to stick to your greasy thumbprint, or you know, a splash of water, or the fact that you've just stamped something else next to it that might still be a little bit damp, not quite 100% dry. So what this does, what the embossing powder does, it has some powder in it, and if I blob that, you might be able to see that powder there. You wipe this over the surface of your card, and what it does is it dries out any moisture that might still be there. So if you've got a stamped image that's still slightly damp, or you know, you've just eaten a packet of crisps before you picked your card up and you've got a bit of a greasy fingerprint, by going over it with the embossing buddy, that will take off that sort of attractiveness, if you like, of those things to the embossing powder. It will put down this sort of chalky image, so that when you then stamp with your Versamark, the only thing that's going to be sticky on that piece of card, or slightly damp on that piece of card, the only thing that's going to grab your embossing powder is the image you've just stamped, and not a stamped image that you've done previously, or a fingerprint, or any of those sorts of things. So embossing buddies are really useful. They're particularly useful on darker card. The darker the card, the more useful they are, because if you've got a piece of black card, everything shows up. So yeah, so these are really useful. But there are some times when it's quite useful, the fact that your embossing powder will stick to anything. There may be times when you want to use that to your advantage, and we'll look at that a little bit in a minute. So let me just pop those embossing powders to one side. I've actually picked up my Free as a Bird stamp set. I picked it up on purpose because I wanted some sort of little images, and I wanted a red rubber stamp set, and I will explain why I wanted a red rubber one in just a moment. Let's start off with this little bird. He's a cute little chap, and let us heat emboss him. Let me just turn my phone on to silent. That's it. So let's heat emboss this little bird. So I'm going to put him up on my block, and we're going to heat emboss him in gold. Gold, of all the embossing powders, is very definitely the one that pops the most, that has the most dramatic transfer, if you like. So if you are just starting out and you want to really feel the magic, then go with gold. Go for gold, very definitely. So I've got my little bird on my block, and I'm just going to ink it up as I normally would with any ink. I'm using the Versamark ink, and we're just going to tap, tap, tap all over our bird. Turn him over. We've used a bit of blue cardstock, so that stands out quite nicely when we put the gold on. So Helen is wonderful, Helen is wonderful, Helen is wonderful. Now then, you might just be able to pick up that sort of faint watermark type effect, and that's one of the things that the Versamark ink does. But now we're going to, and this is the other reason I like having these in the box, I'm going to scoop up some powder, put my piece of card over my box, because then I'm just going to be able to knock that back in. Now there are some little stray bits on there, because what didn't I do? I didn't use my embossing buddy. That wouldn't have happened if I'd have used my embossing buddy. So there we are. We have our little bird covered now in this gold embossing powder, and it is very dull, let's be honest. It's sort of like a sort of muddy brown. sort of like sand coloured. Nothing very exciting about that. But then we're going to heat it up and we're going to melt this powder. Now I always put my heat gun, so if this is the first time I've, in a little while that I've used my heat gun, I allow it to get good and hot to start with. So when it's feeling really hot against your hand, as that is, I am now going to heat this image. Now I don't waft my gun around. Hopefully you'll be able to see that starting to go. I just wait until that part of the image has melted and gone shiny, and then I move on to the next bit and gradually work that all the way round until it is all melted. Let's turn off our gun. So now, rather than a muddy gold bird, we have a beautiful shiny gold embossed bird, and not really going to be picked up the fact that it's raised there, but if you run your finger over it you can feel that raised image on there, and it's really beautiful. So that is just stamping and embossing an image. If this was on sort of shimmery card or something and I was going to watercolour it, embossing is really useful because it gives you that outline, or if you're doing any colouring really, it gives you that outline automatically for colour, for sort of holding your colour in place. So really lovely. So that is a stamped image that we have then heat embossed. You can use your Versamark ink to do an edge on a piece of card. So anywhere where there's Versamark ink, your powder is going to stick. So with this one, on that two sides, I've just literally run it along the edge. On this side, I'm going to do a bit more of a smooshy effect. Let's grab our ink. And this time we'll just dabble that in there. And I always tend to give the card a bit of a flick on the back. So what you might not be able to pick up very much is there's just like a little layer of the powder going around these two sides, but these sides where it's more smooshy, you can see where that powder is sitting. And again, let's heat that up. So this just gives you a very sort of soft, that's sort of gone a bit fuzzy, a very sort of soft gilded edge effect where I've just ran the pad down the side. This gives you much more of a sort of vintagey, smooshy sort of effect. So those are really nice effects. Now, the other thing that we did say is that sometimes there are benefits to your embossing powder just sticking to anything. Water is something that it will stick to. Let's see if I can get a little bit of water in here and put, those are some quite big drops on there. So obviously you'd be a bit more careful with where this is going. We're just playing for now. Right, so now wherever that water spots have been, we've now got embossing powder. So if you want to make it really sort of distressed, and obviously that's, you're drying the water as well as drying the embossing paste there. These do get really, really hot. I might have been better off with a pair of tweezers, particularly with this, as we're having, because we're getting it has to get the powder up to temperature to melt it. You obviously have to dry the water underneath first. So there we are, that's quite fun. So now we have some watery blobbed effects just on top with that embossing powder. So anywhere where there was water, that embossing powder has stuck and it's heated. You can use other ink pads as well as Versamark, so you can use any of the classic pads that we use, particularly if you're using clear. So if you wanted on a white piece of card to do a real red outline but wanted it embossed, you could do that real red outline and then sprinkle it with clear embossing powder and heat that up, and then the colour would show underneath. You do need to be a little bit quicker with that than you would with Versamark. It does, you know, because obviously it dries fairly quickly, so you need to have to get in there while it is still damp. So one of the things you could do with that is do it on on something like a stamparatus, where you could stamp 2 or 3 times to make sure you've got a good level of ink on there that's going to stay really damp before sprinkling on your clear embossing powder. So that's one way of doing different colours, is just stamp with your coloured ink pad and add clear embossing powder to that. You can actually even emboss with stays on, but you do have to be incredibly quick to do that, because stays on is a very quick drying ink. So it's worth experimenting with different inks if you want to try that to get some embossed techniques. You don't actually have to have anything on there at all. Now then, let's just take a little pinch of powder, and I'm just going to sprinkle that powder on top of that card. So I've just literally sprinkled that on. Now if I was to take this heat gun now and sort of put it on the top of that card, it would blow that powder around. So what we're going to do this time is we'll put the heat gun on and I'm going to heat it from underneath. So I've not put anything on that powder to hold it in place. I've just literally sprinkled it on. But once it is melted like that, it's not going anywhere. So that's a really soft effect you can get just by sprinkling on. So if you wanted like snow, you know, you wanted a sprinkling of snow on a card, you could use some white embossing powder to get that sort of a sprinkled effect. So actually, it's, you know, it's once it's melted, it stays on. It doesn't need the ink underneath it to stay there. It just needs the ink underneath it, or the water or whatever, to give you that pattern, if you like. So there we are, some heat embossing. We've got an image, we've got some sprinkling, we've got some splashing with some water, we've got rubbing the Versamark around the edge, sort of smooshy ways, or just rubbing it down the 2 edges to give high glender, give you that sort of gilded edge effect. So there are some of the different things that you can use to get your embossing in place, not forgetting your embossing buddy. But let's talk about a couple of little techniques that you can do, or a couple of other little techniques that you can do with embossing powder. It's always worth remembering with embossing powder that it resists ink, so it resists coloured ink. You can actually use it, and that's perhaps something we'll do in a couple of weeks when we're looking at stamping blends. You can stamp with like a white embossing powder and then colour over the top of the image with a stamping blend. Because it's a permanent marker, it will colour your image. But our normal water-based inks, the embossing powder resists it. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to get the white embossing powder out this time, and I've just got this little flower image just here. So let's find our Versamark. Let's use our embossing buddy to rub over our piece of card, and then let's just stamp a few of these flowers. Now obviously on white card it really doesn't show up very well. Occasionally you'll just, hi Karen, hi Sarah, occasionally you'll just catch in the light and you'll be able to see where it is, but as a general rule of thumb, Versamark ink on white card is virtually impossible. Now this powder has now got lots of funny little things in it, little bits of card and all sorts of things, but I don't know if you can actually pick that up now. There we go, you can there. So I've stamped those 3 flowers and I've sprinkled on some white embossing powder. So let's heat this up. Now this isn't such, it's a bit more difficult to see whether this has turned, particularly on camera. I shouldn't think you'll pick that up at all, but you're just looking for it to have gone shiny. The clear one is slightly easier than the white one because it sort of almost disappears. It looks as if it's gone from white and disappeared. The white one on white card is very definitely more difficult to see, but if we try and catch the light with that, we should be able to see that that is, yeah, it's all gone. So right, okay, that's really interesting, isn't it? White embossed flowers on white card. How very exciting. Not. Right, so I've got some Rococo Rose here. I thought we'd use a bit of Rococo Rose, and I've got a sponge, and I'm going to actually take this mat away, needs replacing anyway, and use my glass mat, because you're much better off if you're sponging something to have a non-porous surface underneath. So this glass mat is perfect. So starting off the edge, coming in and tickle tickle, I'm going to rub some ink over this card, and hopefully you'll be able to see those flowers emerge from the background, because the cardstock is soaking up that pink ink and changing colour, but the embossing powder is resisting that ink. So rather than turning pink, they're staying white. Now you can do this, it doesn't have to be white embossing powder. You can do it with any colour. You can get a bit of kitchen roll and just buffer the top, that will pick up any stray ink that's sitting on the top. So there we go, you've got an emboss resist. You've got that pretty pink card with those white flowers popping out of the background. So that's always a really lovely thing to do, a bit of emboss resist. And one of the other things I thought I would show you today is to do a little bit of triple heat embossing. I'm just trying to think if I've got somewhere a this will be perfect. Now you don't need to use a stamp, you can just put down a layer of Versamark, but we will use this. This is the centre out of the teapot in the tea together, so it's really a sort of non-stamp if you like, but it's just given me a piece of rubber to ink up. So I am going to ink up that piece of rubber and stamp a piece into the centre of that card, and then we'll go back to gold for this. I think it's gold or copper is another good one for doing this with. We're going to take some of our embossing powder and we are going to just add it to that blob. That's very interesting, Helen, I hear you say. Why on earth do you want an embossed blob? Right, so I'm going to heat this up. And obviously once your embossing powder is hot, Hi Carol. It does actually stay sticky, so I'm going to leave my heat gun running and I'm going to put another layer of embossing powder on there. Heat that up. And I don't know if you can see that is already starting to look quite thick. So let's work quickly and put on another layer of embossing powder. Just going to heat down this bottom bit. Try and make that so that I can add some more to that as well. I think we'll go one more for luck. Right. I'm not worried about the shape of this because what I'm going to do in a minute, I'm going to take that stamp off of there and I'm going to put my flower back on there and I'm going to heat this back up. Right, I've got that really nice and hot, and while it is nice and hot, I want to keep it hot. While it is nice and hot, I'm going to take this stamp and I'm going to stamp it in to that embossing powder. Now, you don't ever want to do this with your photopolymer stamps. Only ever do it with your rubber ones. Because what you then get is an embossed, an image that's printed in to your embossing powder. So it gives you like, almost like a metallic embellishment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, let's cut around the outside of that. So that's why it doesn't really matter what shape you've got on the outside. As I say, you can just use your Versamark and make a Versamark blob. It doesn't have to be a particular shape, but those little bits that you get that are the inside of some of the stamps are really useful. So there you go. Don't know how well that's picking up. You now have a gold image impression that's been stamped in to that Versamark. And obviously the more layers you put up, the deeper that stamp will go in. So depending on how deep you want that image, depends how many layers of embossing powder you put down. So that is known as triple embossing, because the idea is you normally do about 3 layers, but obviously you can make it as deep as you like. I mean, out there on the market, Stampin' Up don't do any thick embossing paste powders, but some companies do extra thick embossing powder, and that is one of the reasons why they do extra thick embossing powder, so that you don't have to do quite so many levels. It does exactly the same thing, just that you might have to heat it up, might have to put on a few more levels of this powder to get that to work. And obviously you could do that. There's no reason why you can't mix and match. So I could have had a little bit of gold and a little bit of copper, a little bit of silver, all sorts of things going on in there. So there's no reason why you can't mix your powders. So that is a bit of triple heat embossing. Right, where's my list? Was there anything else I wanted to tell you about today? I don't think so. We've talked about embossing in general. We talked about the fact that we tend to use Versamark, but you don't have to use Versamark. Anywhere that is wet or sticky will pick up your powder, which is why you want your embossing buddy, because you don't always want that to happen. But we stamped our little bird. We ran our Versamark down those 2 edges to just get this gilded edge. We smooched it a bit more down these 2 edges to get more of a distressed type edge. We've splattered water on and dropped powder on that, water splats. We've just sprinkled powder on and heated it from underneath. In actual fact, that is a good point, the heating underneath. Let's use our flower again. Yeah, I'm not sure how much it will show up. It would probably show up more on a more solid image. But there are times, so if you look at this powder just here, you can see that there's quite a bobbly effect to that. And that's because, oh, just leant on my mic and pinged it off. That is because I have heated it from the top. If you'd have wanted that to be a slightly smoother image, let's have a look. Let's see if a blender pen should possibly. Let's do a blob in blender pen. There we go. Blender pen works beautifully as well. So if you've got a bit that's missed, or you want to write something or whatever, you can use your blender pen to pick up your embossing powder. Right, so rather than going from on the top, which gives you this bobbly effect, if you heat it from underneath, sometimes it takes a little bit longer to go because you're having to heat the card up before you heat the powder. But it does tend to give you a slightly smoother finish on your embossing powder. So you don't get quite such a crinkly top, if you like. That perhaps wasn't quite big enough for that to show up. But so you can heat it from the top or underneath, either way, whichever suits you. And obviously, you know, if you've got stray powder that you don't want to blow away, you're very definitely going to heat it from underneath. So there's an introduction to embossing and using Versamark. We are going to come back to embossing powders and Versamark as we look at other techniques. I didn't try to get it all in today. Next week we're going to be looking at another sort of embossing. We're going to be looking at embossing folders, and when we look at embossing folders, we will very definitely be bringing our Versamark and our embossing powders back out. And as I said, when we look at our stamping blends, we'll be bringing our embossing powders and our Versamark back out, because once you can heat emboss, there are so many different options for what you can do with it. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope that there's perhaps something new that you've learned along the way. And one of the biggest top tips is always make sure you put your lid back on your embossing powder, because if you knock it over, it's very frustrating. So let's do that. Let's put our lids on. If you don't have your embossing powder in a box like I do, then you know you can get little trays that you can sprinkle onto that you'll then be able to tip back into the pot, or just simply get a piece of scrap paper, sprinkle it over the top, tap your stray paper, your excess powder onto your paper, and then just use your paper as a funnel to put it back into the pot. You never want to waste it, so always make sure there's some way of catching your powder and putting it back. So I hope you found that useful. I will be back tomorrow at around about 4 o'clock here UK time, because I've got my bingo tomorrow evening, so Facebook Live will be around about 4, and then next week I shall be in on Monday morning, and then it is my aim to do some recorded videos that will go out live at the normal times, because on Wednesday morning next week I fly out to Germany for On Stage, so that's really exciting. So thank you for joining me this morning, and I will catch up with you all really soon.